Welcome to Arnie's Class Podcast. I'm Arnie Aniel. I'm an HR development consultant, an international public speaker, a workshop facilitator, a coach, and an educator. Life is a great opportunity, and we all learn life lessons every day. This podcast is all about those lessons. Lessons like gratitude, confidence, happiness, mindset, and a lot more. Learning without action is information. Learning with action is transformation. Join me, learn, and transform yourself into a better you. In this episode, let's talk about relationship. In my opinion, to be in a relationship is a big decision that we make. It's a risk. Because to be in a relationship, it means you are going to have that connection with someone you don't know. Of course, we don't decide to be in a relationship after an hour or 5 minutes. Of course, it takes time. But even if you are already in a relationship, we continually know that person and discover something about that person. It's not like that the longer we spend before we really make the decision that we are going to be in that relationship means we totally know that person. So for me, it's a big decision and it's a big risk that we take. But what are the things that can make relationship really successful or harmonious? I've heard many times and for a very long time that communication is very important in a relationship. But is it enough? Because I know some couples who actually don't speak the same language, but how come they're still very successful? Yes, of course, we communicate in different ways, and body language is a part of communication, but still, I don't think that communication is enough to make the relationship work. So what are the other things that we should consider or we should do in order to make the relationship works? With my special guest, he's going to share what he knows about relationship. And it includes not only religion, but also sexuality. Life mates, another interesting episode. Listen and learn. Life mates, welcome to another episode. And for this episode's special guest is a doctoral student and Vanier scholar in social psychology at the University of Toronto. He has bachelor and master degrees in marriage, family, and human development from Brigham Young University, where he was a scholar and a valedictorian. He published 35 articles in top psychology, family studies, and sexuality academic journals, focusing on relationships and, mind you, sexuality. His research has featured in popular news outlets such as Psychology Today, Daily Mail, CNN, and Men's Health. So please welcome my special guest today, Natham Leonhardt. Natham, welcome to Arnie's Class.
Thank you. Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm very excited for this episode because not because of sexuality, but because I'm going to interview you about relationships.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Yes. So Natham, let's start. What do you think are the elements or components of a successful relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some of my work and work of a lot of my colleagues. I would say that a good place to start is with virtues. So a lot of the research in the past has focused a lot on skills such as communication, which are certainly important. It's valuable to be able to communicate with your partner, a variety of things in the relationship. That in and of itself isn't sufficient, however. For example, you can be an effective communicator, but that's not going to do you much good if you're effectively communicating how much you dislike each other. There need to be some other things at play, right?
Yes, that's right.
So a lot of the work that I focused on in relationships is virtue focused, where it comes down to things like gratitude, forgiveness, humility, kindness, generosity. These are the types of forces when they become a part of who you are, not just kind of who you do and what you're doing, going through the motions, that these tend to be more successful relationships. So I would say this combination of virtues and skills together is a really good foundation starting point. Not everything, but that's a good place to go.
I see. But Nathan, if you're going to select just one virtue that you think, with all your research and what you have learned about relationships, if you can choose only one virtue that you think is very important, what will it be?
Ooh, just one virtue. That's a tricky one. It's a bit of a cheat answer, but I'm going to say practical wisdom. And a big reason for that is this practical wisdom is knowing which virtues should be utilized at which specific points in time. So, for example, there's danger in an excess in forgiveness or a deficiency in forgiveness, right? You need to find that happy medium where you're forgiving the right amount and with the right intent. If there's not enough forgiveness in a relationship, you're going to be too harsh with your partner. But if there's an excess to the point of trusting to the point of non-accountability, then all of a sudden you're dealing with a very different issue where you're being taken advantage of and potentially staying in an unhealthy or abusive relationship. The idea of practical wisdom is you become wise in kind of figuring out that point in which virtue to be using at a specific point in time and kind of finding that golden mean, as Aristotle would have termed it in the way that he discussed virtues. So a bit of a cheat answer, but it really is crucial in being able to figure out that point of the golden mean and also knowing which virtue should be selected in which specific scenario.
I see. So there are, as I understood, there will be like virtues that couples can actually use, but it depends on the situation where they're in at the moment.
Sure. So, for example, there are some situations that might call for mercy while others call for justice. Both of those things are considered virtues, right?
That's right.
But knowing how to appropriately act upon either of those, there's great wisdom in knowing when the appropriate application is. And sometimes, yeah, they seem to almost contradict each other. And one of the great struggles in life is figuring out how to make seeming opposites work as complements to each other.
When we talk about virtues, I can't help myself but think of beliefs or religion or spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
So, Nathan, do you believe that individuals who have totally different like religion and culture, which of course shape your beliefs and the virtues that you have for yourself, can actually be happy together?
I certainly think it's possible. Yeah, there is some work suggesting that. So if you do have people coming together that are of the same religion and they're high demand religions, where you're bringing together two people that have a similar value structure stemming from their religion, this tends to be a positive force in relationships and more likely be linked to stability. On average, people that are coming into a relationship where one person is from a high demand religion and the other person is from either a different religion or isn't particularly religious, these do tend to be higher risk relationships. There's more of a chance of divorce over time. To be clear, that doesn't mean that's destiny. These relationships absolutely can work. And I would say in the limited work that's out there, there's reason to suggest that as long as there's appropriate understanding on both partners' parts and they know about this going into it and they're proactive in knowing the best way to handle it, then these relationships can work. But just as a general rule, relationships are less at risk when there is a similar value structure of two people coming together.
Because like for me, coming from a Catholic background,
Mhm,
and I've seen some people who are married to Muslim or another
mhm.
religion like Buddhism.
Yeah.
Sometimes one will give in, or one, just like
Mhm,
what you said, one is very religious, practicing, and the other
yeah.
one is not really practicing. Like, for example, Buddhism is different from
Mhm,
Christianity, wherein we go to church, we have this prayer, we have all these festivals throughout the years. While like in Buddhism, they don't really go to the temple regularly and have this all these festivals that they have to go and to attend to.
mhm.
So what you're saying is it's more risk if they are coming from totally different religions or beliefs.
Well, the biggest thing I wouldn't, I don't know if it's the biggest, but a very important consideration is how demanding this religion is on any person's life and what some of the expectations are. So, for example, Orthodox Jews have an incredibly demanding set of practices that they're to engage in. So, if an Orthodox Jew was to marry someone that wasn't an Orthodox Jew, that would be a higher risk marriage. There's more of a risk of that not ending up working out because this is such a demanding aspect of one person's life that the other person isn't necessarily sharing in, right? So the chances, the risks are likely going to be less with, say, a Catholic and a Protestant marrying each other. There's more of a shared value structure that comes into play with that. And then it comes the question is how demanding that person's religion is on that person's life. Is this a religion that's going to be demanding very consistent practices on a daily basis that they're not able to engage in together? As just one example. So again, it's something to be cautious with, and I don't want to be prescriptive in saying people of two different religions out under no circumstances should get together, but it's absolutely something that they should figure out up front in advance and knowing what these expectations are if you're going to try to make that kind of a marriage work.
Well explained. So Nathan, what advice can you give, or how will you talk to someone who's before marriage and seek your advice, and
Mhm,
it's either the man or the woman seeking advice from you that we're coming from different religions? What advice will you give to this person marrying someone
mhm,
from another religion?
mhm. I think it's a little bit repetitive to what I just said, but
Yes.
I think that you make sure that they do discuss this. You make sure that there's clear understanding as far as someone's faith commitment is and the way that that is going to influence the relationship. And I imagine there's probably some resources out there. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but it would be valuable to consider very detailed questions on this subject because there's all sorts of things that come up that they might not necessarily think of as they're getting into this. What sorts of daily practices do you engage in as someone that adheres to this religion? What sorts of weekly practices? What are some of the expectations surrounding holidays? There are a variety of things to consider. And yeah, as long as there's a clear understanding and commitment to each other, and they basically both know what they're getting into, I would say that there's going to be an increased chance of success in navigating those particular issues. And then getting back to what I was saying earlier is communication's fantastic, but likely not sufficient. There's probably going to be some mistakes along the way. You're probably going to want to give each other the benefit of the doubt, be forgiving and understanding when there may be misunderstandings. But then continuing to work through these things, continuing to navigate these differences are also opportunities to grow, right?
Oh, totally agree. Totally agree. I have a follow-up question since you also have a background with family. Nathan,
Mhm,
so with couples from different religions, when they have children,
mhm.
of course, I'm sure you already explained that earlier
Yeah.
about they have to talk and there should be a clear understanding from both sides. But when they have children, and normally, like in the Philippines, normally it's the mother's
Mhm.
religion that the children follow.
Yeah.
What's your advice on this? does one really have to be, it's my religion that has to be followed, or the children should have the power to choose once they are old enough to make the decision on their own?
Yeah. I would say this is a really interesting question, and there are some that suspect that this is at least one of the forces that is driving a decrease in religion, in religiosity and religious affiliation over the last several years. And that's a tricky one, because what do you say? You don't necessarily want to say, look, people in interfaith relationships don't have those kinds of relationships. But it is absolutely an influence. So often the benefits from religion are most clearly seen from the people that are deeply devout. So, for example, if you ask someone how important God is in their life on a scale of 1 to 10, and you want to look at how those different values are connected with life satisfaction, there's a notable jump from 9 to 10.
Oh.
So there's something to be said about being deeply religious and deeply adhering to a specific faith tradition, right? And it can be a little tricky as a child if you have parents that have different views on things. It might be more challenging for that child to reach that same level of depth of conviction in a particular faith and then reap some of the benefits of that. And some of these particulars certainly need to be researched more deeply, but I do suspect, like I mentioned, that is one of the forces that makes it more challenging for youth to see a reason to stay in a religion. They're not reaching that point of deep conviction that they're reaping some of those benefits that many people do. So I do think that when you do have couples that are in that situation, they do have different religious backgrounds, then yeah, I think you do need to give the child the opportunity to choose, right? It's usually not a healthy dynamic forcing adherence to a particular religion, at least after a certain age. But yeah, it's a tricky one, and it's going to differ from couple to couple and family to family. You don't want one parent to think that the other is sabotaging their own faith or something like that. Right. So I don't have a perfect answer there. But I think it is a challenging situation to navigate, and we're just barely starting to get a better sense of what is happening there as there is a rise in interfaith marriages that's happening. So,
Nathan, I have a personal question, which is like a follow-up on this. Will you consider, because you yourself, you have your own religion and you're practicing, right?
Yep, that is correct.
Will you consider marrying a woman from a different religion?
That's a great question, and
excuse me.
The honest answer is likely no. It would take, as someone that is incredibly religious and spiritual personally, it would likely take a very powerful spiritual experience suggesting that this is a specific person that I should pursue a relationship in order to pursue that. My default is I do come from a high demand religion, in being the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That is deeply important to me. It is a core part of who I am. And I myself personally see the value structure that comes from that as so integral to the way I want to live out my family life, that I am doing everything I can and intend to marry someone that is of my own faith. Mm-hmm. And an additional consideration, as we're discussing, is in fact the raising of children eventually, yes, where I don't want to force my future children necessarily to adhere to this specific faith, but I want to give them the best chance possible to experience some of the same joys that I've experienced. And if they find that according to something that resonates with them, I'd love to see them live according to the similar value structure that I've found to be so valuable in my life.
Very well said, Nathan.
Thank you.
Yes. So we're talking about religion or the role it plays in relationship. So now let's move to sexuality, Nathan. What do you think is the role of sexuality in a relationship?
I think it serves a number of different purposes. The quickest and I think most obvious that comes up, particularly pertaining to religion, is procreation. And I think that is a really beautiful thing. It's with a Latter-day Saint background, like we have a very strong belief surrounding us being God, basically being a heavenly father, right? And us being basically children of God. So, and the point of God being a being that creates, I think that one beautiful piece that can come into people's lives with sexuality for those that are more religious is the idea of being co-creators with God in creating a new life. And you don't have to necessarily be religious or have a specific tradition to just really marvel in the beauty of an act of two people coming together and creating an entirely new being, where all of a sudden there's this new person on this earth that's a little bit of you, a little bit of your partner, and a little bit of their own person as well, that somehow comes in the combination of those things. So there's something that's really beautiful in that. Though I also certainly believe that it's something that is designed to be pleasurable, enjoyable, something that brings the couple closer to each other. And yeah, there's something to be said. So I view it as something that can be deeply spiritual and meaningful, but not at the expense of being something that, yeah, you enjoy this together. It is fun. It is, yeah, something to be enjoyed between each other.
This next question.
Build your relationship.
Yeah. Sorry, Nathan. So I have a question because, as I said, I'm coming from the Philippines and a Catholic background. Mm-hmm. And you yourself with your own religion, and at the same time, you have this knowledge and experience about sexuality. Mm. Will you agree to premarital sex?
I would not, personally.
See. Just a question because nowadays there are so many topics to be discussed about religion, sexuality, and relationship. And it's very interesting that with the sexuality, people, of course, are encouraging to know yourself and be authentic and intentional on how you actually behave yourself sexually. And it's a choice that you make. And since we're talking about religion, and there's so many beliefs and so many things that have been said about religion and that refers to sexuality. So that's why I thought of asking you that question, and you said no.
Yep. That's my personal feeling on it. And you know, it's interesting. My view is that by committing to someone in marriage, it fundamentally changes the nature of a sexual relationship, right? I think that kind of a prevailing mindset, well, I think there's a couple different things. There's some that view sex as being something very recreational. And I think this is a smaller percentage of people than what many likely conservative Christians might think. I think that there's a little bit of panic around kind of hookup culture. But the numbers are likely outdated, but from what I've seen, it's maybe 5 to 15% of people that have a very recreational view of sex. They don't, no strings attached, not so worried about it. You select sexual partners in a similar way that you might select tennis partners, right? And just, this is something fun. Let's go and do this. As long as we consent to this and it's enjoyable for both of us, great. Let's have some fun doing this. The overwhelming majority, from what I've seen, is people do still have a relational ethic when it comes to sexuality, of the idea of this is something that should be shared when there's some level of commitment between people that love each other, right? And then there is what might be considered a marital ethic surrounding sexuality. And this is a smaller percentage of people at this point. Admittedly, I'm not as aware of, say, the world statistics. Perhaps there's more prevalence, say, in some countries than much of Western culture, Europe, United States, for example, and usually connected to religion, where there's a view that marriage is something that sex is something that should be reserved for marriage. I count myself in that company. And the biggest thought that I have is, outside of the marital bond, sex becomes something of a trial run that I don't think is conducive to a good, healthy sexual relationship. It's the test drive idea, where I'm going to test and make sure that everything is okay in the sexual relationship. But by so doing, by testing it, it fundamentally changes the dynamic of the sexual relationship. As opposed to, if you make the full commitment first, you recognize this is someone that I feel a sufficient level of attraction to. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Hopefully you have some level of attraction. I don't think you need to have sexual relations to determine that. Hopefully you feel attracted to them, but it's someone you want to commit to, right? Someone
Right.
that you say, this is someone I intend to spend the rest of my life with. When you make that commitment, it psychologically changes the way you interact with this person, right? You think about the difference between someone that's renting a home as opposed to being a homeowner, right? You treat it differently once you consider it to be yours, right?
Correct.
You're going to do a little bit more to maintain, and you treat it differently. So those are some of my personal thoughts and feelings. I understand where other people are coming from, but yeah, that's where I've ultimately landed in the way I want to live out my life and my relationships.
I totally understand. That's why I I understand more why you started with the virtues when it comes to relationship, because just like what you mentioned about, like I asked you about premarital sex, one is willing to do it even before marriage,
Mhm.
and the other one is not willing, and then I think I can see the clash of beliefs there, and I believe that
Oh,
this
sure.
relationship will be in a very challenging situation.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. When it comes to the subject of sexuality, that is at least one other piece of the puzzle for why I personally have decided I would like to pursue someone that shares similar values and similar faith that I do.
Yeah, I think it's very important, because or else there will always be, as I said, a clash or probably arguments between the couples, and later on, just like what you mentioned in the earlier part of our interview, Nathan, about divorce. I'm
Mm.
not sure in Canada, but I believe in the US, divorce is happening like I think every day. It's something that is very routine with couples. I don't know why
Yeah.
it's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the divorce rate actually has dropped slightly over the last little while. I can't give you exact years. I could pull it up, but it's somewhere between 40 and 50%. It's seems to be hovering closer to 40%, and it has dropped a little bit. But what's interesting is marriage rates are actually declining. So although divorce has kind of stabilized, there do seem to be less people that are actually getting married at all. So while most people do have the ideal of getting married, there are some trends of some slight disillusionment starting to occur. But yes, divorce is still certainly a hot topic, and it does happen for a lot of couples.
Yeah. In your
But
opinion, Nathan, sorry,
oh,
you
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
But I was just going to say, I mean, that those average statistics can be a little bit deceptive. For example, there's there are so many things you can do to get ready for marriage that drastically will reduce the probability of getting a divorce. Like, for example, committed members of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints that marry each other, their divorce rate, the last I've seen, was somewhere around 10 to 15%, right? So there's something that's going on there. And I believe Orthodox Jews have something quite similar. I'm not saying you necessarily have to have a specific religious tradition, but being more agreeable, having some of these virtues in place, being better at communication, these skills, these virtues, these can drastically reduce the likelihood of divorce.
It
Whereas
helps,
there's
right?
some
It
people
helps.
that go into it and you might predict they have, say, an 80% probability of divorce based off of the various risk factors they have. So
But in
yeah,
your
just wanted to get that quick note in
yeah,
on
and I
that.
believe it helps to have, like, religion. I think helps somehow in relationships, because I know some people who are like, they're that the marriage is not in a good healthy status, and then because of the religion it helps somehow, based on
Yeah,
my experience with
it's
some of my friends.
hmm, yeah, it's that is an interesting subject there, where generally speaking, those that are more religious do tend to be more committed in their relationships. And on balance, I would say that tends to be a good thing. I will suggest, I've said a number of great things about religion. I think it's also important to acknowledge some potential pitfalls. There can be an excess, right? And some of the danger of being so committed to the point of staying in an abusive relationship, for
Yes.
example. So that is one caution that we should have, where we should obviously do everything we can to be as, if you're entering a marriage, there's typically that expectation of lifelong, permanent, for most people, exclusive relationship. But we have to acknowledge the fact that life isn't perfect and things happen, and it's so. If you find yourself in an abusive relationship, you may want to reconsider that.
That's right. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask you, Nathan, that because we're talking about divorce, in your opinion, or probably if you have statistics or knowledge about this, what do you think is the most common cause of divorce, at least in Canada?
The most common cause of divorce. Well, this is a little bit of a cheat answer again, but it's completely true. It's unmet expectations. So you think about it, and when it comes to that, some of the clearest examples of that are actually with finances and with sex. Those are frequently listed as some of the top reasons for major conflict and people ending up leaving each other for sex, including infidelity and things of that sort. But yeah, the idea with unmet expectations, you're not going to divorce someone unless they're failing to meet your expectations in some way. So, for example, you can be in a totally dreadful relationship, but if it's meeting your super low bar, you're not going to initiate a divorce. If you're
Agree.
satisfied with a low quality relationship, you're going to stick in it.
Yes.
Similarly, if you could have a great relationship, but if you have such skyrocket expectations surrounding what should be happening and it's not quite meeting your expectations, you'll divorce over that as well. So again, a bit of a cheat, all-encompassing answer, but if you want to narrow it down to one thing, it's unmet expectations that tend to lead to divorce.
You mentioned two things, Nathan: finance
Mm-hmm.
and sex.
Yeah, those are two of the pieces that seem to have most conflict in marriages, that can be connected with this unmet expectations concern. Yeah.
Can we talk about more on sex? It's not that I'm not interested in finance, but I think it's more interesting to talk about sex when it comes to expect.
Well, I personally agree. I research more of that. I do have some good friends and colleagues that research finances, and maybe you, if you're interested in that, you can get them on here. I do happen to know quite a bit more about sexuality than finances. So that topic's better for
Yeah,
me as
please
well.
recommend those friends. I'll talk to them about finance, but with you, I'll talk about sex first.
There you go.
Yes. So What do you mean, or maybe you can elaborate more that what do you think is the expectation of couples when it comes to
Yeah.
sex?
Yeah. So one of the tricky things with sexuality is for the vast majority of people, there still is an expectation of exclusivity, of monogamy. And you do see some trends that of openness to non-monogamy in kind of the younger generation. That does seem to be on the rise, but it's certainly not a majority, and I don't anticipate it becoming a majority. Could be proven wrong. I don't know. But as of right now, for the most part, long-term committed relationships, the expectation is monogamy, right? And with that expectation, you have only one person you can go to meet your expectations or desires surrounding sexuality, right? So even for let's take another you want to feel understood. You want to feel as if someone appreciates the big ideas that you can have. You can get that from other family members. You can get that in valuable friendships. There's other people you can go to have that piece of yourself fulfilled, you might say. But when there's this expectation of monogamy, of this exclusivity, you only have one person that you're supposed to go to in order to ensure that you're fulfilled sexually. There's the general expectation that once you commit to someone, you're not going to be going out and having sex with somebody else because you desire to have sex more frequently or desire to engage in a specific act that your partner doesn't necessarily enjoy. So I would say that's one of the biggest reasons why sexuality is such a crucial point of navigation for making long-term relationships work.
But what's your take if, for example, a husband, a man, talk to you and then, well, my wife doesn't want it. And
Mm-hmm.
normally, I believe it's a general belief that men, we have higher sexual desires compared to women. And
Mm-hmm.
how will you talk to this guy, to this man who's talking to you, Nathan? But my wife doesn't want to do it. I want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like at least, let's say 3-4 times a week, but my wife wants it like once a month or once every 2 weeks. So
Mm-hmm.
what can I do?
Yeah. That's it's hard to be overly prescriptive here because every couple is different and there's so
Yes.
many dynamics that are coming into play. One of the first things I would advise is this may be something that you can get counseling on, the both of you, because this is something that is clearly important to get figured out. And if this is an area of major conflict for you, that's not going to be good for the relationship in the long run. And yeah, there's various different things that you can try. You can try turn taking, for example, you rotate between, say, when I'm talking about a husband and wife.
Yes.
You can experiment with the husband initiates sex one time, and then the wife will be the person that initiates it the second time, and then the husband the third, wife the fourth. You get that pattern going, and you might learn a thing or two from that. So, for example, you might discover that when the husband knows that this is the time that I get to choose when we're going to have sex, you may be a bit more selective to ensure it's a good time that's most meaningful. And then the wife, if she has the control, and you've already mentioned that in this case being the lower desire partner, she ends up having control, and she's not feeling the pressure of at some point my husband's constantly going to be asking me to have sex. Maybe a week goes by and she's like, I actually kind of do want this. Maybe not a week, maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's 3. But then she's the one that initiates it, and then he ends up being particularly happy that she's the one that's initiated it, and it's a sign of validation of like, okay, she does in fact value this aspect of our relationship. Again, this is just one example of one type of exercise that may be useful for some couples. I'm not prescribing this and saying this is something that
For
all
all the
couples should
couples.
do. Yeah, but it's just one example. But yeah, there's variety of different techniques that, say, a therapist might advise, and then just having open conversations and being able to say, okay, you want to have this often, I want to have this often. Is there some way we can meet in the middle? Like, let's talk about this. It's likely not going to be a good experience having sex if the other person doesn't want to be having sex, right?
That's right.
So you need to work with each other to come to some solution that is the best solution for both. I will say, though, that hopefully some of these issues can also be troubleshooted in advance. I don't think you need to have super in-depth conversations about sexuality necessarily before you commit to someone if you have more of a marital ethic surrounding sexuality. But at least getting a rough sense of expectations surrounding that before you commit to each other, I think is something that can be a valuable point to consider. If you want to, if you're someone that wants to have sex weekly and the person you're talking with basically has no interest in ever having sex under very select circumstances and doesn't want to budge on that, well, that's something you might want to talk through and consider just how important this is in your relationship and whether that's a dynamic that will work or not. There's danger in either over or underemphasizing sexuality in relationships. And I just think that these kinds of open conversations before making such an enormous commitment to each other could be of real value to people.
I understand. But what if a straight question? Someone asks you, Nathan, but how often is good enough for a husband and wife? Because some people they just ask, come on. Like, for example, they know that you're a psychologist or you're with this vast knowledge about this. And then they just ask, so Nathan, please talk to my wife and tell her how often is good enough.
Oh boy. I feel like there's danger in this becoming too prescriptive of an answer. There is a study that my advisor at the University of Toronto did, looking at sexual frequency and life satisfaction, and found that there were benefits for life satisfaction up to the point of having sex once a week. Any more frequently than that, it didn't hurt anything, but didn't benefit things anymore. But there is something that's interesting about that, where you might want to consider this is something that you're committing to be exclusive with. And it's something that's of value in the relationship. That is something to consider. At the same time, that doesn't prescribe and say you need to have sex for sure once a week. Every couple's circumstances are different. It's something for a couple to be working out together. There's no one perfect answer. I would suggest that for a healthy relationship, if at least one person does highly value sexuality in relationship and you're committed to keeping that between you as a couple, it is something to consider where hopefully you have some sense of regularity and some expectation surrounding that. The exact frequency, there's no one size fits all answer, I would say.
Yeah, very well said. But since you talk about because monogamy, that's relationship to be committed with only one person, and in this case, this is just a follow-up question, and in this case that the man has very hypersexual or with very high sexual desire, will you, I don't want to say will you consider, will you accept that the guy is doing solo sex just to satisfy himself rather than going out with other women?
Well, it depends on what you ultimately want. I think you need to consider what it is that you're ultimately aiming for in your relationship. So the research on this is I've done a decent amount of research on pornography, for example, and I'm familiar with the research on masturbation, not quite to the same extent, but to some extent. And there is going to be a release that comes from solo sex, right?
Yes.
It is something that can be pleasurable. It's something that, it feels good in the moment. I'm not convinced that that's the best long-term dynamic. I think that the question is how I think that there's added value to the sexual relationship when you make the decision that all of your expressions of sexuality are going to be focused on somehow strengthening the relationship, right? And sometimes that means giving up your own temporary pleasures, something that you want in the moment, and holding out for the time in which sex may be available. For example, transition to parenthood is just one example that you might look at right here, right?
Yes.
Like that's a transition that many couples deal with, where for men, sex likely isn't going to be available for a period of time, right? I think that there's a value in a man deciding that the sexual relationship with his partner is important enough that he's going to hold off, he's going to take control of his sexuality and wait for a short period of time until his wife is ready to experience that again. I think that says something about the commitment that you have in the relationship. I think it says something about what sex means to you in your relationship. Admittedly, this is coming in with my personal biases and how I see things. And from a research standpoint, you're going to get a far more ambiguous answer. There's research studies suggesting that complications surrounding pornography and positive and negative links with different aspects of the sexual relationship, right?
Yes.
So I guess I'm speaking from my ethical standpoint. I don't see any circumstance in which viewing pornography or masturbation would be good for what I envision to be healthy in a long-term marital relationship.
Yes. Thank you so much for answering that, Nathan. Nathan, you mentioned about life satisfaction that is in relation to sexual satisfaction.
Yeah.
What's the relation between the two? Why do you think
Well,
sexual satisfaction can also give you that kind of life satisfaction?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much else there is to be said about that. But yes, people that are more sexually satisfied are also more satisfied with their lives and their relationships in general. There actually is I'm part of a study. It's not published yet, but we're in the process. We're looking at nationally representative sample of newlywed couples in the United States. We looked at the connection between relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction over the first 4 years of marriage. And what we're finding is that both men's and women's sexual satisfaction predicts men's relationship satisfaction over time. So there's a couple things to be understood with that.
Men's satisfaction, right, Nathan? Not the interesting.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting on a number of fronts. To clarify, like women's sexual satisfaction predicts her own sexual satisfaction over time. Women's relationship satisfaction predicts her own relationship satisfaction over time. So I think that makes sense. But yeah, the biggest thing to take from both men's and women's sexual satisfaction predicting men's relationship satisfaction over time, there's a number of things to consider. That one, it seems like men, they do highly value what's happening in the sexual relationship, and that spills over into their overall relationship. It is interesting that her sexual satisfaction predicts his relationship satisfaction over time. So there's something to be said about, on average, it does seem that men do care about their partner's sexual satisfaction, which is good news. And if they don't, they should.
Yeah.
If she's happier with the sexual relationship, that's going to be better for the relationship as a whole. It is curious that some of those effects don't spill over to her relationship satisfaction. For example, his sexual satisfaction doesn't necessarily predict her relationship satisfaction over time. It appears that's not as clear of a connection. And maybe there is something to be said. We still need to better understand the exact reasons for that. That on average, I suspect it just is a result of her not quite as highly valuing the sexual relationship as he does. And then there's all sorts of things to consider with that. Generally speaking, I think we err on the side of coaching men to think to become hypersexual and women to become asexual. Like that's the extreme, obviously, but there is kind of a cultural script and expectation where men's sexual expression is kind of encouraged and expected, whereas women's is kind of frowned upon. And there are some dangers with the way we socialize that, right?
That's
So
right.
all sorts of things coming into play.
Yeah, that's right. That's a double standard. I really like that comment.
Yeah.
Like, men, you can express it, you can be hypersexual, but women, you have to be more naive, you have to be, more composed. You are not supposed to talk about your sexuality in public and
Yeah.
things like that. But we can't change that overnight. And I think it will
Yeah.
still take a long, long time before it can totally change and
Yep.
accepted.
Yep. And once again, to be clear, we're talking averages. Like, I mean, with that stereotype, we might call someone inhibited in sexuality suffering from good girl syndrome. Like, we use gender terms to describe that, whereas men that are considered more hypersexual, we'd call that bad boy syndrome or something like that. Just gives you a sense of how gendered the way we think about this can be. But as a reminder, there are relationships where men are the lower desired partner. There's relationships that, yeah, women are very interested in sex and men aren't quite as interested. These do happen.
Yes.
Not the typical case, but yeah, that's why we have to be cautious with our generalizations. And
Exactly.
when it comes to working with a specific couple, you have to take their specific circumstances into account.
That's right. Yes. I totally agree with that, because I think those not really typical relationship wherein women are more hypersexual than the men. I don't think it's being discussed publicly or it's very common. That's why I think we still believe or we still follow that kind of belief or generalization that men are supposed to be hypersexual than women.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Nathan, we're almost towards the end of our interview. I just want to ask, I'm sure you've met a lot of couples, or you've heard a lot of relationships. So with all those relationships, which one you find very challenging when it comes to like how to make the relationship really work?
Just well, I think it goes back to a lot of what we've been saying before, but it's really hard when you can't agree on core values. There are issues that are foundational, that are more value based. There are issues of kind of compatibility, and then there are preferences, right? And you want to have similarities when it comes to your core values. It's very hard. For example, if you want to have 5 kids and your partner wants to have none, you can't compromise by getting a dog. Neither one is going to view that as like the appropriate solution to that particular conflict, right?
Correct.
So when it comes to these core issues, these crucial values that are really important to people and how they want to live out their lives, it's important to choose a partner that is congruent on your most crucial of values. There's so many things that I think we get caught up in that might not be as important. You don't. Hopefully, you have some similar interests. Hopefully, if you were to have your lists of favorite movies, there'd be some commonalities. But your top 10 favorite movies don't have to be the other person's top 10 favorite movies, right?
Yes.
Maybe you have 2 or 3 in common, and you don't particularly like 2 or 3 of your partners, but they can enjoy those films on their own, right? That's not something that's going to make or break a relationship. These are issues of preferences where hopefully you have enough interests in common that you find activities that are worthwhile, that you can enjoy doing together. But you don't need to have all of your interests perfectly aligned. What really is crucial is some of these core values that you have in sharing those, I would say. If you don't share those, it's going to be pretty hard to make things work long term.
I want to ask, is there any issue or topic or problem or concerns that you've heard about relationship that really like shocked you? Like, wow, what is it? So something like a wow, unbelievable. Have you heard any? As I said, it can be an issue, it can be a concern in relationship that in your experience really like shock you and it's like, wow, I never heard of that.
Huh. Well, I don't want to say I've heard everything, but I suppose the stories that shock me the most are stories of what I view as being pretty intense abuse and allowing that to continue to go on. Every once in a while I come across one of those stories that is shocking to me, that uh, they allow that relationship to continue when things, all signs that I'm seeing are that it truly is horrible. And I just see that as being something very sad, something very tragic when I do come across those kinds of stories of just continual abuse for a sustained period of time, whether it be physically assaulting,
Verbal abuse.
infidelity, all these different things being involved, and still not being able to leave the relationship. Some of those stories still shock me and I find tragic, I would say.
Yeah, I've heard, well, I've known some people who are in those kind of relationships, and to tell you, I really don't understand why they're still in the relationship. And I think it's been a part
Yeah,
of their system and they get
sure.
used to it and they just want to
Yep.
continue. And I know it's a hard
Yeah,
decision.
yeah, it's true. And I mean, we are so complicated as people. It's going to be extremely challenging to identify any relationship where everything is 100% problematic. So even in these cases where, say, on the outset, it looks like basically everything is horrible, they likely have at least one or two positive memories they can turn to, in being able to hope, oh, well, this person can change, or this is a sign that there's good in this person. And yeah, I don't believe anyone is necessarily 100% evil or a problem, but usually our lives are complicated enough that someone can turn to at least one or two of those memories or one or two aspects of a person, even if so much else about them is horrible, that they view that as sufficiently redemptive in order to hope that somehow things will get better and it's worth sticking it out. Either that or they just have nowhere else to go, where if they end the relationship, they see the situation as, they see the alternative somehow as being even worse than what it is that they're getting from the relationship. And that's another thing that really is just sad.
Yeah, very sad. Nathan, before I ask you my 3 standard questions to my guests, I just have this. I don't know whether this happens in Canada or in other parts of the world, but in the Philippines, it's a common question among women. When selecting their partners or their husband to be or their boyfriends, there are 2 choices they said. The one I love or the one who loves me.
Interesting.
If a woman asks you that question, Nathan, how will you answer that question? Because in the Philippines, there's even actually a song. Who am I going to select? The one that I love or the one who loves me?
They don't see those things as going together, eh?
No, sometimes it's like you have 2
That's
choices.
not an option.
No,
you love each other. Isn't that okay?
Yeah, love each other, but there are like 2 options. You love that, for example, the woman loved that guy, but the guy loves her, but not that much. I mean, she loves him more than he loves her.
Okay, yeah.
And the other way, or the other guy is the one who loves me more than I love him. So what do you think is the best choice here? It's just your personal opinion. I'm just interested to hear.
No, that's an interesting question. And I think that is fair to ask. I mean, I think it's pretty much, I think there's a good chance that lots of people are going to end up in a relationship where one of the people is more committed than the other, right?
That's yes.
Or desires the other one more than the other. I would say, yeah, I have a hard time answering that question. Perhaps I'm too much of an idealist. Perhaps I'm too much of an idealist, but I think that I think you should try to find a relationship where you're both seeking to develop as deep a love for each other as possible. I don't believe that the initial stage of commitment is the peak of love by any stretch of the imagination. If you
Totally
can
agree.
find a relationship where, yeah, maybe one is a little bit higher in commitment and interest than others, but if you're committed to the ideal of marriage jointly together and you see yourself as committing to a life together, you're committing to the idea that we're constantly going to be growing in our love for each other, right? So rather than thinking in those terms, which inevitably, yeah, I'd say that one person is likely going to start out more, at least slightly more committed or more interested in the other.
Yeah.
Find someone that's at least committed to growing in love together. And then here's one of my favorite relationship stories. There was a colleague of mine that wanted to study sacrifice in relationships. And he found something really interesting. He found that those that sacrificed more had better relationships up to a point. Those that had the best relationships reported the lowest level of sacrifice. And he's like, what is happening here? What is going on? Why is this the case? So he actually went and interviewed these couples, had a more in-depth interview to understand the dynamics of their relationships. And as he talked with them, it became clear that by pretty much anyone else's standards, they were sacrificing more than anyone else. The difference was they no longer considered it to be a sacrifice. Thinking in those terms no longer made sense to them of I'm giving up something of value to me for the benefit of my partner. They had developed such a we mindset that I'm not giving up anything because your happiness is my happiness. Now, obviously, there can be dangers in the extreme of being overly dependent. But the idea is you're developing a healthy interdependence together over the course of time, where maybe even get to the point where sacrifice doesn't feel so much like a sacrifice anymore because you value the happiness and meaning in life for your partner enough that you're ready and willing to do whatever you can for them. And they return that for you as well. If that is only going one ways, I don't think that's a healthy dynamic. But if both of you have that perspective of being so cognizant of each other's wants and needs and desires, wanting to ensure that you're being responsive to whatever you can to help each other in the relationship, I think that's a great thing to commit to and the type of love that you should try to grow towards in a long-term relationship.
That's very interesting. Thanks for sharing, Nathan. Wow. Sacrifice. Before, just last question, Nathan.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard about love is about give and take. Relationship is about give and take. What is your take on that?
I think that it's one of the questions you're going to have is what stage of the relationship you're in, right?
Yes.
I think in earlier relationships, it is natural to have a bit more of an exchange mindset where, for example, the mindset I just described there of that type of sacrifice, you don't want to have that mindset with someone you're on a second date with. That's probably not a healthy dynamic, right?
That's right.
In early relationships, you want to think more in terms of exchange and a healthy cost and benefit analysis. Admittedly, that's not how we often work with relationships, but there is a very emotional component to it of natural affection and attraction you feel towards someone. But it also is valuable to take a step back and weigh out more rationally kind of whether this is a relationship that makes sense, right? So I would say in the beginning part of the relationship that, yeah, you don't want to be taken advantage of. You want to be cautious about entering a relationship with someone that only takes and doesn't give, right? But then as you slowly start to develop a feeling of trust towards each other, and you realize that, I can afford to give a little bit more. And without even worrying about it and keeping score, my partner tends to give back, right? Maybe in the earlier stages, there is a bit more of a keeping score in kind of the dating stage. As you're figuring out and filling out the extent that this is someone that can be trusted, that's someone that's going to take care of you and have your best interests at heart. But then hopefully as you're moving closer and closer in commitment to exclusivity, to the engagement stage, to marriage, there's more and more trust being developed. And hopefully you have less of a give and take mindset, but it just naturally becomes part of the relationship in the way that you start to live out your life, where there's times that you're going to give more, there's times that you're going to take more. Just based on the different scenarios that happen in the relationship. And I will say this, it's important to be both a good giver and I'll call it a good receiver. If you give so much to the point of not accepting any help, you're actually limiting your partner's ability to develop a closer connection to you. Oh. Ideally, you have a relationship of mutual self-fullness is what I like to call it. Selfishness is someone that only takes and never gives. Selflessness is someone that only gives and never takes, right?
That's right.
Hopefully with the self-fullness, there's both parties that are committing to being good at giving to each other and receiving help from each other as well, right?
Nice. Thank you so much. Now, Nathan, my standard questions for my guests. Number one, so with all the research that you've been through, you've known, you've read, you've written, and with the talks with all the couples, it's either about relationship or personal, like something general in life. So what do you consider the greatest lesson you've learned?
So I'll give maybe a more denominationalized religion answer, but then I'll also try to broaden the principle. For me, following the teachings and example of who Christ is the best life that I believe someone can live. In looking to Christ as an example and trying to live out with the type of virtue that he lived in, whether you're religious or not, following those general principles, I really do believe that leads to the best life that you can have. Now, what does that look like on a broader level? I believe that finding that point, I think that the most meaningful, high quality life is at the border of belonging and becoming. If you can somehow find that happy medium between security and growth and find that point, that border where you're reaping the best benefits of both of those and striving to live a better life, I think that ultimately is kind of at the core of what a Christ-like life is, but you don't necessarily have to believe in who Christ is in order to follow that general principle of finding that place of maximal engagement and meaning where you're navigating the borders of those opposites of security, growth, belonging, becoming, etc.
Nice. Thank
By
you.
proving contraries, truth is made manifest. It's a favorite quote of mine from Joseph Smith.
Can you say that again, Nathan?
By proving contraries, truth is made manifest.
Nice. Wow, that's meaningful. Thank you so much. And my second question, Nathan, my second standard question. Of course, life is about choices. We always make decisions. And what decision you've made, can you just share one particular decision you've made in the past and has an impact, or if I may say, huge impact of who you are now?
Yeah. We've talked about religion a lot, and I guess I'll go with that again, where mean, there's a series of decisions that could be connected with that. I would say the decision that I made to get baptized when I was 8 years old has really been so foundational to the way I see things in the world, the way I live out my life. There's a number of other crucial decision points, like, for example, choosing to live in Bulgaria for 2 years as a missionary was enormous. But I guess I go back to the baptism because that was foundational to some of those
Yeah.
later decisions. And I say that that decision was so critical because it put the value structure in place in my life and giving me a rough ideal for what I could aim for and what the way I wanted to live my life. And there's been refinements along the way. I understand my faith is certainly more nuanced and deeper than it was as an 8-year-old. But ultimately, it is the tenets of my faith that inform what I find to be most valuable in life. So that decision really was critical to the way that I see the world and the way that I live out my life. And hopefully, even for those listening without a religious background, hopefully people can at least identify a crucial decision that was kind of a value structure setter that, I think we all have. Basically, all of us have those critical moments that help set our values in stone, whether we're aware of them or not. Because if you don't have a value structure in place, life pretty quickly becomes pretty painful and even meaningless without something to aim for.
But actually, it's very interesting that you are religious, and at the same time you also into sexuality and really, it's
Yeah.
not a common thing. It's not a good. I know I would say it's not a good combination, but I think it's not unexpected combination, religion and sexuality, and it's interesting. And I
Right.
hope you'll find out more, Nathan, and you're really contributing to the world something that is valuable and important because you're going to help a lot of people. So I hope you do some research more about sexuality and religion.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'll do my best to live up to that.
Yes. So my last question before I say goodbye, and I really thank you for your time and sharing your precious time in my podcast. So Nathan, if you or maybe someone else is going to write a book about your life, what will be the title of the book, and what will be the book look like?
The title would maybe be something like I've got two options. They're pretty similar. It'd be something like either academic mind and poet heart or iron will and tender heart. Like I feel like that really is like that's one of the core contraries I'm trying to prove and find truth in right now. I'm very academically disciplined. I do my best to be tough-minded and really think through things critically, and yet kind of the core driving force is very emotionally driven. Some very critical emotional moments that have happened in my life that serve as motivations behind the work that I do. And oftentimes my intuitions, my feelings, they come into conflict with the things that I read about and come to understand in my academic discipline. And I'm constantly trying to reconcile those contraries and finding the way to live a most worthwhile life. So yeah, I'd say that is kind of one of the core conflicts or core contraries I'm working to reconcile and prove at this moment, how these pieces can work together and ultimately coming to a greater sense of truth and knowledge, not just for knowledge's sake, but useful knowledge that can be applied to better people's lives.
Wow, I like that. Oh, well, Nathan, everything that is good comes to an end. And of course, we have to end our interview. And I would like to thank you so much for your time, for sharing your precious time, and of course, your experiences, your knowledge. Thank you so much. And God bless I hope and I wish that everything that you plan, everything that you want to achieve will be achieved very soon. And all the best on your doctoral degree, because I'm sure you're going to be Dr. Nathan very soon.
That's the hope within the next few months. That's definitely the goal. Thank you so much for your kind words. It's yeah, it's really been my pleasure talking with you. You asked some really great questions, and
Yeah.
it's been fun talking about some of these things that are important to me and hopefully important for a lot of people.
I'm sure. Again, thank you so much, Nathan. And to my life mates, to all those who are listening, if you like this episode, please share to your family and friends, because I'm sure they can also learn from this episode. And with my very special guest, knowledge and experiences, I'm sure it's worthwhile to spend some time and listen to this episode. So, everyone, once again, listen and learn.